Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we're talking about PouchDB. We are your hosts, Justin Barrow, Leon Revel, and Danny Blue.
Hello,
gentlemen. How are you doing today?
Hey, Justin. Doing great. How about yourself?
I am doing swimmingly, as they would say. I believe you said that just before we started this episode.
I did. I think it's it's starting to become get warmer over here on the East Coast of the United States. So I think swimmingly is an appropriate term.
I would agree with you, kind sir. Today we're going to talk about PouchDB, but before we kick it off with our guest today, let's go to Leon with This Week in the Web. Leon.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Justin. So this week we have got an article which was published called Password Rules or BS by the co-founder of Stack Overflow, Jeff Atwood, which basically is kind of raging about how password rules are so stupid. It's really quite insightful, but the too long didn't read is, just use a long password. It's totally fine to use memorable words, just as long as it's long enough. So instead of trying to remember crazy characters and all that kind of madness, long passwords, which are memorable, are totally fine. Next up, we've got a new kind of feature in Chrome. So Chrome 57 now throttles background tabs, which is to increase battery life, which I think, is a known thing with Chrome. So it's good to see that in there. Mozilla has proposed the Obsidian Web Graphics API, which is basically a low-level API intended to provide a maximum feature set for the GPU to web graphics. It's similar to Vulkan. It's designed for WebAssembly and modern GPUs, and it's in like a multi-threaded environment. Android O was announced, which has got a multi-process mode for WebView, which could be quite interesting for hybrid applications. And it gives you an API to let your app handle errors and crashes. And finally, in This Week in Web, we have Microsoft Edge is now in the development phase for the option to mark an event listener to fire only once, which is available in other platforms already. So that's good to see that coming to Edge. And that's everything for This Week in Web. Back over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. So we're ready to get kicks started up here about our topic of the day. We're ready to get kicks. Sometimes speaking is hard for Justin. Danny, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Sure thing. That's something that I can do. So with us this week, we have a special guest, Nolan Lawson, who is a WebPerf PM at Microsoft working on Edge and is also a PouchDB maintainer. So Nolan, thank you very much for being on the show with us this week. And can you give us a quick little introduction other than what I just said?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Happy to be on the show, by the way. Listened to it for a long time. Really big fan.
That's awesome. We're glad you like it, and we love to have you. Justin is rubbing off on the rest of us.
That is what I do with my beautiful words. But thank you so much, Nolan, for being here.
But yeah, to follow up on what you said, yeah, I work as a program manager on Microsoft Edge. I also maintain a lot of open source projects, mostly JavaScript based, including PouchDB. I'm also kind of known as a blogger, so I have a blog at nolanlawson.com that people may be familiar with, where I talk about stuff like optimizing JavaScript and avoiding problems with small modules and offline first and things like that.
So it's brilliant. We'll be sure to put it in the show notes so people can check that out.
Cool.
I feel like your blog is way better than my blog. At this point, mostly I just talk about children tortoises and how you can wrap technology around them. So, as a longtime reader, well, you can't wrap a tortoise around a child. Of course, that's not legal, Danny. But I've been reading your blog for a long time, Nolan, and it's just a fantastic resource. Thank you so much. I realize how much time that must be for you to put in.
Oh, thanks. I'm happy to hear that. No, it's a really good. It's a good outlet for me. Sometimes I just have like some bonkers idea, on a Sunday, and I just like want to write about it all day. And so it's really heartwarming to me that people actually, value what I have to say and are interested in it. Yeah, but
So how does
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
how does one find the time with all your blogging and all your edge work and all the things you do for the web? I mean, PouchDB, like, tell us a little bit about it.
Sure thing. PouchDB is an open source JavaScript database. It runs both in the browser and in Node. And kind of the selling point of it is that it allows you to build web applications that work well offline. So you can write data locally to this local database that kind of lives inside of the browser. And then that data gets synced back to the server once you have an available connection. And it supports the CouchDB sync protocol, which means that it supports CouchDB and CouchDB-like databases, such as Cloud and Couchbase. And there's even a version of PouchDB that is mostly CouchDB compatible that can run on the server called PouchDB Server. And that's just implemented purely in Node.js.
Yeah, so I've used Pouch for probably coming up to 2 years now. It's a super awesome project. But for anybody that's not familiar with it, who would use PouchDB for what kind of projects and those kind of things?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's really designed for this offline first use case. Like it's kind of part of this larger offline first movement, along with sibling projects like the Hoodie project. And the idea is that you want to build an application that's going to work well regardless of the network conditions. Actually, Alex Russell on the Chrome team has a really good name for this. He calls this predictable performance. The idea is that it doesn't matter whether the user's connection is blazing fast or if it's offline or if it's somewhere in between. It's something where it's like really high latency or really low throughput or something like that. You just get this predictable performance where no matter what the network conditions are, you're just talking to this local database primarily. And so you always know that it's going to respond fast because it's the local cache, essentially.
So really, it's for kind of any web-based JavaScript application. It can be used with any kind of framework and those kind of things as well. Is there any recommended stack to use it with, or what's the story there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So PouchDB is definitely framework agnostic. There's kind of a learning curve that comes with it. We do expect you to understand like some basic JavaScript principles. Like you should definitely understand asynchronous programming. So the API that it offers is either promise-based or callback-based, depending on whichever flavor you like, or async functions, since those are essentially just based on promises. But the reason that it's all asynchronous is that under the hood, it uses these asynchronous storage APIs in the browser, such as IndexedDB and WebSQL, or you can just use it as a straight-up interface to CouchDB on the server, in which case it's communicating over HTTP. But in either case, you've got this asynchronous API. So understanding that is really, really useful. But in terms of frameworks, there's actually lots of different adapters for PouchDB to use in different frameworks. There's one for Angular. There's Ember Pouch, which is just built on top of Ember Data. So you can just use Ember Data like you normally would, and it's using PouchDB under the hood. There's RxDB, which is using RxJS observables. So if you're a big fan of observables, you can kind of use that model on top of PouchDB. In terms of React and Redux, there's quite a few different Redux adapters for PouchDB. They kind of use PouchDB as the Redux store. That's the idea. And then, probably one of the coolest things I've seen is that the Polymer project has some PouchDB components. So the idea is you just have these HTML tags essentially that manage your PouchDB for you, like no JavaScript required, which is really kind of amazing to me. But yeah, there's lots of cool use cases built on top of PouchDB, and then you can always just use vanilla PouchDB as well, which is often what I do.
Yeah, I find that the API, just the vanilla API generally, is really quite nice and easy to use, well documented, all the kind of nice things you'd expect from like a popular open source product, which is great. You've mentioned the syncing in PouchDB before. That's like one of its main kind of features, and you talked about the kind of offline working thing. But you could potentially sync up multiple clients as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the PouchDB replication system, well, it's based on the CouchDB replication protocol. Basically, whatever CouchDB does, that's what PouchDB does. It's a shameless copy. Like we really just copied like API for API. It does exactly what CouchDB does. That's kind of one of our principles. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to hook into CouchDB's multi-master replication system, which the idea behind that is that it's kind of a different way of thinking about syncing than you may be used to with if you just think of it from the client-server model. Because in the CouchDB system, it's multi-master in the sense that there's no like leader-follower. Just every node is its own master. So essentially, you can have multiple nodes. You can write to any node in the network, and any node can sync to any other node. So you could potentially sync, you could potentially have multiple servers that sync between each other. So if you want to reduce latency, you could have a CouchDB that's in Europe, and then another CouchDB that's in Japan, and then another CouchDB that's in North America, and then the user just uses whichever one's closest, and they sync to each other. And then on the client, you can also sync peer-to-peer. And there are actually a few different peer-to-peer implementations of PouchDB, although it's not supported in core. But there's ways of doing it over WebRTC. There's a node-based peer-to-peer sync on top of PouchDB called the Tali project, THALI. But yeah, it's very much kind of modeled around this idea of decentralized peer-to-peer sync.
Yeah, that's super cool, and the fact that you can sync kind of peer-to-peer, it opens up quite a lot of opportunities. Because let's be honest, resolving conflicts and syncing stuff, it's really difficult. And when I've used it, it's obvious how well PouchDB does it, and it just works, and you can just sync stuff all over the place, and it's amazing. So, really lots of opportunities there for that kind of feature. So I can see why it's such a USP for Pouch.
Oh yeah, I would say that's the primary USP. USP is unique selling point. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, just double checking. We have so many acronyms in the tech industry. I have trouble keeping them straight sometimes.
So does PouchDB, in terms of performance, obviously any kind of database or persistence layer, obviously performance is quite a big thing. So how does Pouch do anything in terms of performance, making sure you can get at that data quite efficiently and quickly across the different platforms?
Well, yeah, definitely. So, you want to ask me about performance. Well, I'm on the performance team at Microsoft Edge, so I think a lot about performance, like day to day. It's one of the things I kind of obsess over. So if you really want to ask me about performance, I can talk for hours on the subject. But just very quickly, kind of the way that we think about performance in terms of PouchDB is there's basically three types of performance that we care the most about when we're creating PouchDB. The first is startup performance, which is which is the idea that when your application loads, you don't want a big pile of JavaScript, megabytes of JavaScript slowing down that initial load performance. This is becoming more and more important, right? Because people are having to deal with gigantic Webpack or Browserify bundles that are slowing down their app. So we were actually one of the first JavaScript libraries I'm aware of that started using Rollup in order to produce the smallest possible bundle. And the idea there is that Rollup is a bundler that is based on ES modules. So you can have a very, very modular code base. Like we actually have an extremely modular code base. We almost always have like one function per file. Like it's often very, very, very much constructed like that. But when it gets bundled, what it does is it essentially spits out one gigantic index.js file that is it's kind of like the file that you would have written if you had just written the whole project as a single JavaScript file. And that has some huge benefits in terms of bundle size and in terms of the startup performance. I have a whole blog post about this that I wrote last year called The Cost of Small Modules, where I talk about these different bundlers and I kind of compare their outputs and how the more modular you make your code, and some of them it kind of penalizes you because you end up with more and more cruft that winds up in your bundle. So that's one thing we really focused on. In that same vein, we also introduced custom builds recently, so that if there's a feature of PouchDB that you're not using, you can actually just you can use a much smaller package. You can install a much smaller package from npm and just use those features you want. So, for instance, if you're not using replication, then you would just install the PouchDB core package, and then you would omit the PouchDB replication plugin package. Or if you don't need to support older versions of Safari or Android, you can just cut out the WebSQL adapter and just use the IndexedDB adapter. And we're actually starting to expand out into more and more modules to try to make it more modular for the user. But in the end, if you want to just use the main PouchDB package, that gets rolled up into like one very, very tight bundle. So that's one way we think about performance. The other two ways that we think about performance are replication performance, like how fast it is to sync between the client and the server. And the other thing we think about is runtime performance. How much are we blocking the main thread? What's our latency between PouchDB and the underlying data store, be it IndexedDB, WebSQL, or LevelDB in Node? Did you have a question? It sounded like you had a question.
So I had a question. It's kind of related to the modularity of PouchDB, or what it seems. Because you're focusing so much on the modularity how modular these pieces are, does that also kind of open it? Like, PouchDB doesn't have like an official plugin system, does it?
Oh, we do. Yeah,
Okay.
it's PouchDB.plugin, and there's a lot of third-party plugins that you can download, and then also many of the core packages themselves are architected as plugins. So for
Okay,
instance,
that was really my question, is if they were built as plugin, as add-ons or plugins for the core, and how if that was available to third-party users. But okay, so that's perfect. That's awesome.
yeah, absolutely. PouchDB itself is actually just a combination of the PouchDB core package and then 3 or 4 plugins essentially. And this gives us lots of nice properties. Probably the nicest one that I enjoy the most is that we have a package called PouchDB-browser, which is just what you need to run it in the browser. And then, of course, there's a converse, PouchDB-node. And what I like about the PouchDB-browser is that many people don't want to run PouchDB node. They just want to run it in the browser. And so we just cut out all the node dependencies, and then it doesn't have to install like LevelDB, which can be kind of a hefty native dependency. So that's nice.
Yeah. So what kind of size are we looking? So if at the bare minimum, if you were just going to pull in just pull in core, just what you needed it to run, what kind of size are we looking at for the client-side library?
Oh, that's a good question. So right now, the full bundle, if you just grab pouchdb.min.js off the website, it's about 45, 46 KB minified and gzipped. If you were to just use PouchDB core, I think that's somewhere around 20, 25 kilobytes, I want to say. And we're actually working on extracting more and more things out of core. So we've got some features lined up in PouchDB 7 that will move even more things out of core. We're probably going to move out the MapReduce module entirely and just make that an optional plugin. Because our goal is to just get it down to be as tight as possible. So the idea is we want it to be easy for people to get involved. Right? There's this trade-off between usability and customizability, right? So we don't want beginners who are new to PouchDB to get confused, to start using PouchDB and then half the things don't work or something, or it breaks in a certain older browser. So our default bundle is supposed to be the kitchen sink. That's kind of the idea. And then if you are a power user and you want to go in and read more about custom builds and you want to kind of mix and match and make your own, then you can. And so we're trying to strike a nice balance between those two.
No, I think that's a really good idea, because inherently configurability breeds complexity. So having that default bundle that's just ready to go, I think, is a great idea.
Yeah, I think what we're kind of trying to aim for is like, I think Babel had a few issues with the Babel 6 rollout, which they themselves have acknowledged. And like to their credit, like Babel 6 is amazing. I love it. But what we're trying to aim for with PouchDB, I think, is that like it kind of works like Babel 5 for the default case. If you're just like, you skim the docs, you want to use the thing, and you just like, just get going. And then if you want to, you can kind of get into Babel 6 mode and start, tweaking everything to your liking.
When I was saying that, I was also thinking about Babel 6 and the lessons that can be learned from that rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I don't want to just take up the whole hour talking about performance, but really quickly, the other two types of performance that we think about are replication performance, which we've actually been working with the CouchDB project to improve the CouchDB replication protocol and make it a little bit less chatty, so make it a little bit faster. In CouchDB 2.0, which just shipped, they have this new endpoint called bulk get, which we use under the hood and which leads to much faster replications. We also have this project called PouchDB load, which can be used where you can just kind of take a PouchDB or a CouchDB and dump it to a file essentially, and then just load that file as a string into the database, which we find that a lot of people really enjoy because oftentimes they have like a large kind of starting point for their database, like a starting data set, and they want to just load that on the client really quickly. And then the other thing we think about a lot is performance of the database itself as you're querying it. And in those cases, most of the time, we're actually just kind of waiting on IndexedDB under the hood. So we've been taking advantage of some of the new IndexedDB 2.0 APIs like getAll and getAllKeys in order to really speed up those IndexedDB operations. We've also started caching a bit more heavily with our IndexedDB calls. But one thing that I would caution people to do is that if they are thinking about getting into PouchDB and if they feel comfortable with web workers, I would say to put PouchDB into a web worker and kind of isolate it there. And the reason I say that is because many browsers today, even though IndexedDB is an asynchronous API, it actually does quite a bit of work on the main thread. It tends to. And so this can lead to, if you're blocking the main thread that means it can lead to kind of jankier UIs or delays when you're tapping on buttons. And for PouchDB, it's a database. It has nothing to do with UI. So it's quite easy to just put into a web worker. And I have a whole blog post about this called IndexedDB WebSQL local storage, what blocks the DOM. But anyway, yeah, so those are the three main things we think about with performance. Yeah.
That suggestion is really good, actually. I'd not considered that. And yeah, if you could send us a link to that particular blog post, it'd be great to share that in the show notes. I'm certainly going to read that. That's like a really good idea. Excellent.
I just love web workers. I run everything in a web worker that I possibly can, or almost anyway.
Yeah, web workers sort of rule for a lot of things that we build too. It's one of those features that I always feel like is underutilized on the web platform because
100% it is underutilized. And I think part of it is I don't think a lot of people realize how well they're supported, like for all the browsers. Like I think they work back to IE 10 or 11, something like that. The support for them is great. Use web workers.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of the adapters we've mentioned. So you've mentioned the IndexedDB adapter and the kind of, I think, the more legacy WebSQL adapter. So PouchDB is a cross-platform. Kind of what platforms does it support and how does it do that?
Well, when it first started off, the goal was just to support IndexedDB. It was kind of born out of IndexedDB. And then over time, we added the WebSQL, the WebSQL adapter, because it turns out that IndexedDB is kind of had a troubled past. Like it didn't reach full support in all browsers very, very quickly. The spec was proposed in, I think, 2010, 2011. And really, it's only like now, I would say, especially with the most recent release of iOS, iOS 10.3, I think it was, they have excellent IndexedDB support now, which kind of took a while to build up. But even other browsers like Chrome kind of took a while to add things like blob support, array buffer support, and Edge, we still have some parts of IndexedDB that we don't support yet. So it's kind of an uneven platform to build on top of. So we wanted to make sure that was really nailed down solid, and that people could just drop in PouchDB and it would just work, and they wouldn't have to think about, is this using IndexedDB under the hood? Is this using WebSQL under the hood? We would just figure out all that cross-browser messiness and just kind of make it work. Like my goal with PouchDB was sort of to make it like the jQuery of databases, right? I just want it to work across all the browsers. So we thought early about abstracting out this concept of adapters, of the layer between PouchDB and the underlying data store system, which is actually really nice because now I think there's something like, I want to say at least 10 adapters out there in the ecosystem for various data stores. The ones that ship with Core are IndexedDB and WebSQL, which is what ships in the browser. In Node, it's LevelDB, which is a very popular kind of simple key value store. It's actually the same, under the hood, it's actually the same thing that Chrome uses to implement IndexedDB. The other browsers use different things. Firefox and Safari use SQLite, and Edge uses a thing called JetDB. But anyway, so we have the LevelDB adapter, and then there's quite a few other ones. There's there's one on top of local storage. So just in case you need to support quite old browsers, you actually can use PouchDB on top of local storage with the local storage adapter. There's one called Node WebSQL, which is an implementation of a very light implementation of WebSQL on top of native SQLite running in Node, so that you could just use the WebSQL adapter, but in Node on top of SQLite, which is quite nice. There's a few other ones that have different use cases. There's the in-memory one, which is really nice, especially for unit tests. I love using the in-memory one for unit tests because it's just, you don't have to actually write data to disk anywhere. There's one called FS, the FS down adapter, which just writes to the file system, so you don't install any native databases for Node. There's quite a few of these that have popped up. There's a few for React Native now. It's quite a flowering ecosystem.
Wow, that's amazing. There's many more than I thought, and they kind of can be utilized quite transparently as well, from what I understand. I mean, you can specify specific adapters, but at least in the IndexedDB WebSQL kind of situation, like you said, PouchDB just figures out which is best to use and kind of takes that away from the user. Is that correct?
Exactly. By default, if you just call new PouchDB, it'll just figure out what to do under the hood if you just use the default package. But you can bring in your own adapters, third-party adapters, or you can swap out. We have a few different first-party adapters you can swap out, like the memory adapter. And in those cases, you just say new PouchDB, give it a name, and you just say like adapter : memory, and now it's using the in-memory adapter. Like we try to make it as simple as possible. And all the APIs end up being exactly the same. It can still, you can get, you can put, you can look at the changes feed, you can replicate to CouchDB. It's very full featured.
And that full feature set gives developers a really good leap point, right? I mean, I think the nice thing about Pouch is that because you can simply get more work done quicker. You know, because when you sit there and talk about IndexedDB, like IndexedDB for me was always very hit or miss. Like if you go back in time and see kind of, as you mentioned, like its implementation details, like it was a massive pain, like to deal with at, you know, just a vanilla sort of level of things. And it was kind of a problem if you wanted to get things done quickly. But Pouch has a lot of really solid defaults that you drop it in, you start using it, you get quite a good performance, and you get quite an ability to work quickly.
Yeah, that's one of the other faults of IndexedDB that definitely comes up when you talk to people who've used IndexedDB a lot. Now, I may be a little bit different. I have kind of Stockholm syndrome with IndexedDB. Like I've just used it so much that I fall in love with the thing. But yeah,
I can understand that. Like,
well, I've learned all the little corner cases and everything. It's just like I'm just kind of they're all deeply embedded in my brain. But to his credit, IndexedDB was not really designed to be used directly. Like I think a lot of people make this mistake where they want to just minimize their dependencies. They want to use this API directly, and then they run into so much pain. And the reason for that is that the author of the spec, Nikunj Mehta, he was an invited expert from Oracle that they brought in to kind of design this new database API for the web. The idea was that local storage wasn't going to be good enough because it was synchronous and it had race conditions between the main thread and web workers, and so that was kind of a non-starter. And then WebSQL was a non-starter because Mozilla and Microsoft wouldn't implement it, mostly for kind of philosophical reasons. It was like we don't want to just take SQLite and embed that in the browser and call that a web standard. Like the quote I love from the mailing list at the time was something like, "You can't just point to a pile of C code and call that the standard." So WebSQL was kind of dead in the water too. They brought in this Oracle expert to design this new kind of NoSQL database that all the browsers could agree upon. And one of the principles of it was that it would embrace the extensible web manifesto. So it wouldn't try to be all things to all people. It would just implement kind of the core building blocks of what you would need for a database, and then others would build databases on top of it. In fact, I think the author himself is really funny. He mentions in a blog post somewhere, he says, "Hey, maybe someone will implement a JavaScript CouchDB." And then, what do you know? Here we are. We actually do have a JavaScript CouchDB. And there's quite a few other interesting databases implemented on top of IndexedDB as well. Things like DexEJS and LocalForage and IDB KeyVal, like all these kind of taking their own spin on IndexedDB and using the core building blocks to present a much nicer, a more intuitive API for web developers.
And I think that's the nice thing about sort of the extensible web manifesto as it was, is that, we did get a lot of primitives sort of out of that ongoing conversation about we'll build on top of these things. And the ecosystem's grown quite a bit. I mean, Pouch is a very fine example of just how well that sort of worked out. Because realistically, you couldn't really do the things Pouch does now, 6 or 7 years ago. Like the web we didn't have nice things, but it's gotten way better. And now we have cool things like Pouch.
Probably worth mentioning back on the kind of abstraction. So, as a general PouchDB developer, you don't really need to care about any of the IndexedDB intricacies most of the time. At least I've not really come across any in the lower level that are kind of using Pouch. Is you just put documents in, get documents out, and it all just works really well. A really nice layer on top of that. So generally, you don't have to worry about that.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. That's exactly what we were going for. Ideally, someone should be able to use PouchDB and not even know what IndexedDB or WebSQL or all these different things are. Like I said, the goal was for it to be like jQuery for databases. You can use jQuery without knowing all the things it's doing under the hood and how it fixes this bug in this browser and this other bug in this other browser. It should just be just pick it up and go.
That's actually a really nice way to kind of put it. It takes out a lot of the pain of trying to do weird things on lots of different platforms. It just kind of takes that away for you, just like jQuery did. Excellent. So obviously, when it comes to databases and storing data, often you want to kind of get at that data, and you might want to query that data and retrieve, specific sets of data. Could you describe a little bit how that currently works in Pouch and where that might be going?
Yeah, sure. So right now we have there's two built-in indexes to PouchDB. This is actually something that's good to highlight because a lot of people miss this. Because of the way the replication protocol works and because of the way CouchDB is implemented, essentially what it kind of does is it sort of keeps track of all changes over time. And the way I like to think about this is it's kind of like Git for databases, right? Like if you want something to work well offline, like Git works really, really well offline, right? And the reason for that is that it stores this revision tree, this history of every operation that's made on the database, and you have it all on the server. And then when you do a Git fetch, it just pulls all that to the client. You can work locally, work with your branch, make a change, and then push that back up. So because of the way that, and CouchDB's model is very similar to Git kind of conceptually. So because of that, you end up with these two built-in indexes. And the first one is an index on ID, which is like this primary key. It's just underscore ID. And then the second one is the changes feed, which is a list of all the changes made to the database over time. So actually, one question we get frequently is like, oh, I want to build an index on top of PouchDB that shows me that sorts all my documents by time, and like they come up with like this this custom solution built on top of PouchDB. And we're like, well, you can just use the changes API for that actually. And I'm like, oh, so that being said, you do need a generic query mechanism. I mean, any database needs that. At some point, those two indexes, the primary ID and the changes feed, might not be enough for you. So for that, we offer two different APIs right now. So the older one and the more kind of battle-tested one is the MapReduce API. And so what that is essentially it's a function that you implement called a map function that goes over, iterates through every single database or every single document in the database, and then you can emit a key and a value, and then that becomes your secondary index that you can then use for querying. And what we discovered though is that this is a very powerful model. Like you can essentially do anything with this, right? It's incredibly powerful. But we've also found that it's kind of confusing for new users. Actually, we discovered this both in the CouchDB project and in the PouchDB project. But it's a big pain point for newbies. Some people already are comfortable with MapReduce. They come in, they're like, oh, this is MapReduce. I know what to do. I'll just get started. But for many people, they want something a little bit simpler. So for that, we've started developing this second API called the Find API. Which is in right now it's in a separate plugin called PouchDB Find, but we're actually in the process of moving it into core. It will probably still be technically a separate package, but it'll be kind of maintained as part of the core project. And the idea with Find is that it takes the core of MapReduce, it takes the core secondary index algorithm, and then it builds a query language on top of that. So you can specify something really simple, like you can say, hey, give me all documents where the name is this and the age is greater than 20 or something like that, right? You can just index on name and age, and it's a new query language. It's exactly the same query language that is supported in CouchDB 2, which is called the Mango query language. It's kind of a pun because we essentially borrowed it from Mongo. We were like, okay, people seem to know the Mongo query language. They seem to like the Mongo query language. Fine, we'll just implement something very, very like the Mongo query language, and we'll call it Mango. and so that shipped in CouchDB 2, and then we have a mostly complete implementation called PouchDB Find, which is it's currently in beta, but it's going to be out of beta very soon. Ideally, once we can iron out all the bugs. I know Leon, you found I think 2 bugs in PouchDB Find, and we fixed one of them, and the other one is on the backlog.
And it's so incredible that you fixed it in like an hour. Like I was, so happy. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. But essentially, you have these 2 APIs that at the end of the day they do the same thing, and one of them is just kind of much simpler for people to dive into, especially if they're not familiar with MapReduce. With PouchDB Find, you just have this declarative query language that you use to express your index. But again, it's in beta now. It'll be out of beta soon. If there's something that doesn't work for you in PouchDB Find, you can always just go back to using MapReduce. But we're working hard to make sure that they get to feature parity.
Yeah, from what I understand, you'll be putting that in the core, and then you said earlier in this episode that the MapReduce functionality won't be going away, but it'll be turned into a separate plugin instead. Is that right?
Oh yeah, and I should be clear. When I say moved into core, I meant moved into the core repo. Like one thing we started doing with this roll-up model and with this custom build model is we've embraced the mono repo. A lot of other projects are starting to do this. Babel does this. Ember does this, where you have like one repo that contains multiple packages. So we actually publish, I think, something like 20 or 30 packages, all from this one repo. And previously, PouchDB Find was in its own GitHub repo, but we've now moved it in, and in the next release of PouchDB, it will be released as part of the PouchDB project. So it might not actually be in the PouchDB-core package. We're trying to keep that as tiny as possible. For people who, some people don't even want to use MapReduce or PouchDB Find. They just want to read and write data, right? So that's what I meant by moved into core.
Cool. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So people can just, like you said, optionally choose the bits they need and then keep the actual core functionality as small as possible for performance reasons.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what's the user feedback like for Pouch? I mean, obviously the project has grown quite a bit since its sort of infancy. Obviously, there's, if you've come from CouchDB, from the Apache side of life, this probably makes a lot of sense. I mean, do developers take pretty easily to Pouch as a whole? Like, are there particular problem points that people run into often where, they need a little help, or, that's where, ideally people can help provide documentation to the project?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, we've definitely found that people who are already familiar with CouchDB, let me make sure I enunciate correctly, CouchDB. People who are already familiar with CouchDB usually jump into PouchDB with no problems. And that's because we've had this very, very strict goal of compatibility from day one. So 99.99% of what you do with CouchDB, you can do it exactly the same with PouchDB. All the APIs return exactly the same response. This is actually how our test suite works. We actually, our test suite is basically split into two. We run one set of code against CouchDB, and then we run the exact same set of code against PouchDB. And if CouchDB says one thing and PouchDB says another, then PouchDB is wrong. That's usually the way that we approach it. So we've seen a lot of people come over from CouchDB who already knew how CouchDB worked, already were comfortable with that, and then they pick up PouchDB and they're productive on day one. Where a lot of people get confused, I think, is that PouchDB and CouchDB are both quite different from other databases. So even if you're familiar with a NoSQL database, so CouchDB is a NoSQL database, and so is PouchDB. But even if you're familiar with a NoSQL database like Mongo or Cassandra, there's quite a few differences between CouchDB and PouchDB and other databases, mostly related to how it handles synchronization and replication, because that is a core feature of CouchDB and PouchDB, and it kind of informs everything about how the database works, which tends to surprise a lot of people who are just coming into it for the first time.
Yeah, I think the replication protocol is one of those things that if you haven't sort of done that sort of thing where, that is sort of the core tenet of it, it can be a little disorienting if you've come from sort of other systems. But admittedly, once you sort of understand that baseline of how it operates, there's just so many nice, powerful features in there that make, particularly when you're shuffling a lot of data and you want that sort of consistent performance. We use it a lot too for some industry stuff where connectivity just becomes problematic. Like, you're in the middle of nowhere and you need to make sure that everything is going to resync correctly. The fact that you don't have to spin it, roll your own mystical solution on top of some things is quite nice. And the community has grown a lot around Pouch as well.
I'm sorry, guys, but I think we're having a fire drill or something, so I might have to cut this podcast short. Hang on a second, let me ask what's going on. Yeah, Microsoft chose the wrong day to have fire drill. So I'm very sorry. I don't know what you guys want to do.
It is not.
Okay.
We'll figure that out and get in contact with you. Don't worry.
Yes, this is staying in the episode.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nolan, for joining us. Please exit the building.
Thank you, Nolan. Exit the building. Don't catch fire.
Okay, so I suppose we can.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, it's not amazing. I'm hoping it is actually a fire drill and not an actual fire.
Yes, definitely. So for anybody who hasn't already tried out PouchDB, they totally should do. like I said before, I've used it for a while and various different projects, not to its full extent, only kind of the very basic functionality, but it's kind of such a great solution for, persistence and the syncing mechanism and those kind of things. So have you guys used it before, and in what kind of projects have you used it before?
So I have not used it, and there's a question I was going to ask Nolan that I will now direct at the two of you. So I haven't used it. We've talked about other persistence solutions, like we talked about GunDB. I feel like we've talked about a few other things. But one of the things that I always like to ask about these types of solutions is, what aren't they good for? Like, what? Can you guys hear me?
We can do, yes.
Yes.
Okay. I just got a terrible warning that said my VoIP connection to Nolan Lawson has failed. Retrying. Yeah.
Oh no, the building might be on fire. Nolan,
Yeah.
if you're out there, we hope you're okay.
But anyway, so yeah, what isn't it good for? Like, what would be a bad? So we talked about what is a good use case. Are there any use cases that are just not suited to this type of solution?
I imagine maybe Justin's probably got a better answer. But typically, I imagine, obviously, if you're persisting really, really simple data, something that, local storage could perfectly handle, I imagine that's a situation where you wouldn't, bring in PouchDB for that case. Honestly, though, I tend to use PouchDB for pretty much exclusively for all of my kind of web app persistence needs in hybrid applications and web applications, because it's kind of really easy to kind of get up and running, and it just works really well across all the different platforms. I've kind of not really come up a situation yet where I wouldn't want to use it, apart from what I've just described there, where the data you're persisting is so simple that it kind of doesn't, overkill. It would be the word for using PouchDB in that sense.
Yeah, I agree with you, Leon. I think for some folks, like if you have a thing where you're kind of cursory using local storage and you want better performance, Pouch is going to give you that, sure, but at the same time, you could probably use Local Forge, which will give you similarly better performance and asynchronous sort of interactions. So, you kind of have to weigh the use case. I mean, we use it quite a bit these days, more so in the last year or so, as we've started to shuffle some things out that were relatively custom, where we were using things like the file APIs in Chrome and things, where we were doing very, very, very big data sets. And Pouch works pretty well with this, but this is also because of the nature of the underlying sort of infrastructure, like those primitives we talked about. The notion being that for a while, IndexedDB, when Pouch first came out, it was on IndexedDB. Like, it didn't quite work for me, only because IndexedDB, for the kind of data that I was shoving into it, was simply too slow. And I knew this because we had done it, with our own sort of stack on top of the primitive. And you sort of have to weigh that thing. But these days, I mean, yeah, I don't really I'm in the same boat as Leon. Like, if I have persistent needs, and it's going to be, things that are going to sync across multiple plants or wherever, we're operating this sort of thing for these web panels, like I would be hard pressed to find something that's not as bulletproof these days. Because Couch,
definitely.
Couch itself is, it's been around for a while as well, and it's got its own JSON API and things like that. But Pouch just makes life a lot easier as a whole. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily use it if you could, all the time, but you could also do it through other sort of means.
Okay. My last question, kind of related to that, when you guys do use PouchDB, do you use it to sync data from client to server, or peer to peer, or do you use just on the client side?
So I tend to just use it on the client side. Like I said kind of earlier, we have kind of played around with the syncing feature and it works really nicely. But honestly, we just use it so we've got the data there, locally, and then, the data sent up using APIs or whatever the app does. Generally, just use it to store data locally.
Yeah, my basic use case is the local style, but we do server sync too. Some of our cases get a little complicated, admittedly, primarily when we have things that need you need really close statuses, not necessarily real time, because obviously, in some of the situations we're in, you're not going to get real time, but you still need to make sure that when it reconnects up that, we're not doing as much peer to peer, but yeah, through the server side, yeah, it works out pretty well for us.
All right, cool.
So I believe we're about coming up on time, as it were. Nolan is not here to thank, but we're going to thank him anyway because it's just amazing to have him on the show.
Definitely, yes. Very grateful that he could take the time and come and talk to us about the awesome project. He has just been messaging me on
back.
Yes, definitely. He has just been messaging me on Twitter, so he's okay. I am suspecting it was just a fire drill, and hopefully nobody's actually, hurt.
That is good. That is good to know.
So, is there anything else we missed on this, kind sirs, as we come to the end of the episode?
I can't think of anything right now.
Me neither.
So if you want to find PouchDB, you can find it at PouchDB.com. They're also available on GitHub, where the issue tracker is. So contributions are always welcome. Help your local open source project if you can. Nolan, you can find on Twitter at Nolan Lawson. So you can find him quite easily. And if you haven't read his blog, we'll put it in the show notes. You really should take a look. It's a fantastic resource for web developers out there. So thank you, Nolan, for being on the show. He's probably saying thank you remotely at this point.
I bet he is.
So this has been, indeed, episode number 127, talking about PouchDB with Nolan Lawson. I am Justin Barrow.
I'm Danny Blue.
I'm Leon Revel.
And this has been another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. We will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.